Welcome back to Rolling Solo. My name is Adam Smith, and I'm really excited to be diving into a game called Cloudspire, my 2019 strategy game of the year. This game comes from Chip Theory Games, and in this video, we'll be kicking off a showcase here on the channel, which is going to start with the solo setup. We're going to begin with the very first scenario from the solo scenario book, which literally is its own book devoted just to solo play that is included inside the base game of Cloudspire, as well as learn how to play the game. So without further ado, let's dive into the setup. Checking out the very first page of the Solo Scenarios book, solo and cooperative modes offer a new way to play Cloudspire. These modes provide a number of scenarios to complete, each presenting different challenges that will test your strategic thinking, adaptability, and in cooperative mode, collaboration skills. Solo mode is laid out as a campaign. The scenarios are meant to be played in the order they are presented in this book, allowing you to follow the narrative that accompanies each scenario. The solo scenarios are broken up into sections based on the faction you will be playing. All scenarios are laid out over 3 pages, giving players all the information needed to play. For this showcase playthrough, we're going to be controlling the Brawnen faction in the Ignition scenario, which is scenario number 1 for the Brawnen. Campaign is playable solo, of course. Waves, there are 4 of them, and the opponent we're going up against in this one is the heirs. Underneath of this, we have this setup section where we're rolling a single D6. This D6 roll is going to determine if any changes happen to the initial setup shown below. We'll also be following first, before we make this roll, this key right here in red in order to determine all the spires and hero placements across this landmass. Once we have that all set up, we will then go ahead and roll that d6 to see whether there's any changes to the initial setup. So without further ado, let's set this up and then we'll roll our d6. The 4 isle tiles have been placed exactly as shown in the Ignition scenario. We also have to attach the faction fortresses. The very first one we'll attach is the one for the Brawnen faction on this far left-hand side. With our fortress in place as depicted from the scenario book, the next thing we'll do is populate the 2 trackers on the fortress, one for health and the other for source. You'll also see a little gem on the side of each of these cutout areas of this fortress. And for this very first chip, which is the Gate Health Tracker chip, you're going to want to make sure that it's set to 10. So just ensure that the alignment of the gem is with the 10. For the source side of things, you'll want to ensure that the source tracker chip is the 0 to 20 side of the chip and not the 21 through 30 side of the chip, and also ensure that it's set to 0. So again, using this gem here on the side to depict exactly the value of the source in your fortress. The heirs faction fortress has been set up on the opposite side of the isles from where our current Brawnen fortress currently sits. And I've also gone ahead and placed the health tracker chip in at 10 and the source tracker chip in at 0. Next, for both the Brawnen faction as well as the heirs faction, we're going to put those chips for each faction into their respective trays in a particular order. Within each of the faction trays, the important thing to note is that each of the faction units, whether they be heroes, minions, or spires, should be in particular rows. At the very front row, you'll find your 3 faction heroes. There's one of each of those. In the 2 rows in the middle, you'll find all of your minions grouped by the same types. And then at the very back, you'll find spires, again grouped by similar types. As long as you keep this structure, it'll make things easy to find when you need them. The exact same similar arrangement can be found with the Brawnen here, where I have my heroes up front, minions across the 2 rows in the middle, and my spires in the back. Also ensure when setting up your faction tray that none of your units are showing their leveled up side, which is denoted by this star right here. They should all be on the side without a star, unless of course there's some type of scenario rule that states a particular unit will come into the game on its leveled up side. Next, you're going to want to find the reference sheets for the specific faction that you're controlling, as well as the faction that you're going up against, or factions. In this case, it's just the heirs for me. I'm controlling the Brawnen, so I've got all the faction reference sheets I need. On these faction reference sheets, you're going to find some flavor text for the faction involved. You're also going to find fortress advancements all laid out, so you can tell exactly how you can increase your fortress to give you benefits during the course of the game. An area that's very important to note, especially for solo players in the first scenario, is there is some information in this faction specific section up top here above the talents, where it talks about additional information and the fact that Brawnen start the game with a Forsaken die, which gets slotted into their fortress from the beginning of the game. This is the type of thing that could be easily missed, so make sure that you read these reference sheets before you begin your game to make sure you don't miss any great benefits. Down below, we've got the Brawnen talents. These are all going to correspond back to the units of your faction. So if you have a particular unit and it comes out in play, you'll see certain keywords on that unit, like armored for Cram, for instance, a hero, and armored is listed right here in one of the Brawnen talents, and you can determine exactly what that is. This is the reason you'll want this reference sheet close by, because you'll be referencing it often. The Forsaken die is specifically referenced under the Fortress Advancements inside the Honor Pit section, and we'll talk more about how it's used later on, but you can see right there it says Forsaken die. So we know that this die I gain at the beginning of setup is going to go into the Honor Pit slot within our fortress. So as we just talked about in terms of fortress advancements, we know that the unlocked Forsaken die is going to sit in the Honor Pit, so I'm going to go ahead and slot that in. You'll also notice that dice that actually relate to the guild you're using will also match the color of the chip for your particular unit. So it's very easy to find all the dice which you need from the beginning of the game. There should be 3 for each faction. In this case, one of them for me is slotted into my fortress. The other 2 are out of play until I actually am able to use them following game rules. Another thing to make mention of is inside your faction, you'll also have not only areas for dice to sit, but also these peg holes for advancement. Again, tracking your advancement of your fortress areas. For the Brawnen, I've got things like a source drill, assembly area, stronghold, gate port, and the honor pit, as well as a smelter, but it's different for every faction. If you happen to have the Cloudspire miniatures expansion, then you'll want to go ahead and grab the Spire miniatures for each of the factions in play. It certainly adds a nice level of depth and also height in terms of how big these spires will tower over everything. Also makes things in terms of organization of the chips quite nice, with spaces underneath to store things. So for the Brawnen, I've got 3 at the ready right here. There's much more inside that miniature box, but 3 is good for now. I also went ahead and grabbed 3 for the heirs. You'll want to ensure that the health chips as well as your upgrade chips are within easy reach. They're comprised of 3 different types: attack chips, range chips, and fortification chips as well. Ensure you have your 1 blue and white D6 at the ready and the 6 spire attack dice. Now we're going to go ahead through the setup using the legend on the ignition scenario to go ahead A through F, putting all spires and heroes into play as it notes. The other thing to make mention of is the fact that after each of these different units coming in, there is a whole bunch of letters following them. There's a quick legend right down here that says A is for attack, which means attack upgrade, R is for range, which is a range upgrade, and F is for fortification, which is a fortification upgrade. And you have to ensure that you stack these upgrades as it states inside this key or legend on the scenario. So the first one we're going to set up is A, which is right here, which is going to land right here on the map. So it's going to be a high-rise spire, which is going to sit right here. And because I have the miniature expansion for Cloudspire, I can actually use a miniature to depict this spire, which of course just visually makes this thing that much more cool. And on top of it, helps with organization of keeping the chips in one place. But the other thing I have to do for the high-rise spire is, as I mentioned, the A and RR means 1 attack and 2 range in that order. So the attack chip is going to be on the very top of the pile, and then we're going to have 2 range chips that are going to go underneath. So it will stack like so. We simply go ahead and place them underneath of the spire like this, and can place the spire just like that. So I will be doing this for all of the rest of the spires, and then we'll deal with the heroes. All 4 of the spires for the heirs have been set up. As you can see, we've already talked about the high rise down here. This one underneath has a single attack chip and 2 range chips underneath. Over here we have a larger spire, which is called the minaret, and underneath of this particular spire there is 2 attack chips. We have 2 range chips and 5 fortification chips. Here we have a regal lookout spire. Underneath we have 1 attack chip and 2 range chips. And near the back, closer to the heirs faction fortress, we have another high rise. And this particular high rise has an attack chip and a fortification chip underneath. Next, we're going to put our hero into play, Cram the Mighty, as depicted by the legend in this scenario. Cram the Mighty starts with 5 health, so we'll simply put 5 health chips underneath of him, and he'll start in this position. The final hero to set up comes from the heir faction, and it is Darb. Darb also comes with 1 attack upgrade, as denoted by the scenario, plus the 3 health for Darb, so there he is, all set up. In the AI notes, there's some special instructions. It says, Darb remains in the Air Fortress and is considered out of play until he is deployed in Wave 3. So, we'll go ahead and place Darb inside the fortress a little bit further back. Not going to be part of the action until Wave 3. Speaking of specific scenario rules, it also notes that Cram the Mighty is the only hero the Brawnen may deploy during this scenario. So that means, noting the fact that we have set up our faction tray correctly, the other 2 heroes, which should be at the front of the tray, cannot be deployed whatsoever in this scenario, so we might as well remove them to ensure we don't do this accidentally. Now we're going to go ahead and set up landmarks on this particular region. And the first thing we'll do is take all of the white chips, and we're going to find the 1 white chip with this back right here and remove it, because this is a specific chip that might be called upon during gameplay, but shouldn't be in the pile when setting up your landmarks. So we'll remove that right now. The next thing you're going to want to do is take all of the white chips, and you're going to want to separate them so that the swamp chips are off on their own. So all of these are swamp back white chips. You can see they all have the same back here. As long as you've got those all in a pile, you're on your way. On the other side over here, you're going to have 2 different backs remaining in this other landmark pile over here. The reasoning for this is because the swamp back landmarks are going to be landmarks that are going to show up in source wells nearest the fortresses. So in this particular situation or scenario, we have a source well right here depicted in this light blue color kind of shining up through the ground, and a couple over here as well. And these are actually the only source wells in the entire map. So ironically, when setting up the these swamp landmarks, normally one would go to the closest source well next to the fortress. So for me, my fortress is here. This is the closest source well, so this is where one of the swamp tokens will go. And normally another swamp token would go to the fortress on the opposite side where the heirs are, but they're all covered over by spires. So no more swamp tokens are needed now. Again, this is all part of the setup. It only can be swamps for this step. Now that we've gone ahead and set that up, we then take all the swamp token landmarks and we merge them in with this pile right here. We shuffle this pile up and then we randomly will distribute the rest of the landmarks on the map, of which there's only 2 other spots. And just like that, all of the source wells now have landmarks on them. Next, we're going to go ahead and set up the relic deck and the event deck. Both of them are shuffled. We also over here have the neoprene earthscapes. There are 8 of them. We'll go ahead and flip the top one upright so we can see what it is. And now we're going to go ahead and build out the market. And there are 20 market chips here. We're going to draw 3 of them right now and reveal them. The first one is Baza. The second one is the bunker. And the third one is Stave of Envasi. Also ensure that you keep the talent reference sheet within easy reach. This is going to give you information specific to landmark talents on one side, and on the opposite side, merc talents. I'm sure you remember earlier on in this setup video when I spoke about this section of setup for ignition, which states roll a d6 and see what happens. Well, we need to do that at this point because it could actually affect the spires that we've currently set up. So I'm going to go ahead and roll this d6 and see how it goes. All right, so we ended up getting a 1, and a 1 on this particular chart says set up the spires as shown. So literally, I don't have to change anything. A 1 and a 2 would have given that result. A 3 and a 4 on this particular die would have had us swapping A and B spire placement. So that would have been us actually swapping this spire right here with this big beefy one right here. If we got a 5 or a 6 on that roll, we'd be swapping this spire right here with this spire right here. Again, it would affect where the largest and most annoyingly tough spire is to take down. At this point, I'm going to go ahead with the correction that I mentioned on screen a bit earlier in regards to the source wells. Originally, when placing the landmarks, all 3 of these were available spots, 1, 2, and 3. We have to place a swamp landmark in the closest source well to our fortress, which I did correctly for my fortress, but I did incorrectly for the enemy fortress. I determined at that point in time that because it was covered over, it's underneath this spire, that I wouldn't have to place a swamp landmark, but you still do. You actually go ahead and find the next nearest source well, which would be this one right here. So this swamp location will be here instead, and this one is valid as I pulled that one at the time. And that's going to wrap up the solo setup for the ignition scenario within the Brawnen campaign within the solo scenario booklet of Cloudspire. Really hope this helps you get the game to the table and set up quickly. Thank you guys so much for watching, and really hope to see you in the upcoming playthrough. And as always, keep on rolling solo.